What you are looking at is not a king. It is a death sentence in a crown. On a Tuesday in November 1177, the fate of the medieval world rested on the shoulders of a 16-year-old boy who was physically rotting away. The math of that day was a cruel, impossible equation: 500 against 26,000. The Judean desert is a place where the sun doesn't just shine, it punishes. The air is so thick with heat it feels like inhaling liquid lead. It is a landscape of flint, dust, and bone, where the only thing that grows is the shadow of empires. On one side, you have the shadow of an empire, the Grand Army of Saladin. It is a tidal wave of 26,000 elite warriors, Mamluk guards in yellow silks, lightning-fast horsemen from the deep desert, and an unstoppable force that has finally united to erase the Crusader states from existence. They move like a storm of iron, a collective machine of war that has never known a true equal in the Levant. And on the other side, just 500 knights. A few thousand ragtag infantry, exhausted from a frantic march. And a boy named Baldwin IV. This is the Leper King. He has to be helped into his saddle because his legs no longer have the strength to grip his horse. His right arm is a map of tragedy, wrapped in linen to hide the decay. To the 12th century world, his condition was a curse from the heavens, the mark of the damned, a sign that the soul within was as diseased as the skin without. But to Baldwin, his disease was a chilling tactical advantage. After all, how do you intimidate a man who can no longer feel pain? How do you break a king who is already a ghost? But the impossibility of this moment is what makes it legendary. Most kings spend their lives trying to avoid the inevitable. They build monuments to ensure their name outlives their breath. They marry for alliances, they hoard gold in deep vaults, and they die for their country only when they have no other choice left. But Baldwin was already dead. His sentence had been passed at age 9, the moment a tutor noticed he didn't cry when needles were driven into his skin. He wasn't fighting for a future he would never see. He was fighting for a singular, defiant no. The only question left in the desert heat that day wasn't whether Baldwin would die. It was whether he would take an entire empire down into the grave with him. How does this happen? How does a teenager who cannot feel his own limbs, who cannot even grip a sword without bandages to secure his hand to the hilt, outmaneuver and outfight the most legendary commander of the Middle Ages? How does 500 beat 26,000? This isn't a myth. This isn't a Hollywood fabrication with a choreographed happy ending. This is the moment a walking corpse saved a kingdom and earned the respect of his greatest enemy. This is the story of a man who used his own impending death as a weapon of war. When you are 16 and you know for a certainty that you will never marry, never father an heir, and never feel the touch of a cool breeze on your skin again, the impossible stops being a deterrent. It becomes an invitation. Before we break down the tactical genius and the sheer, beautiful insanity of the Battle of Montgisard, I have to ask, have you ever heard of the Leper King before today? Or is he just a masked figure you might have seen in a film? Drop a comment below with, "I knew him," or "First time." And if you are ready to see how history's most overlooked underdog changed the map of the world forever, hit that subscribe button. You are watching the Impossible History series, where we prove that the greatest stories aren't written in ink, they are written in blood, iron, and the unbreakable will of those the world gave up on. To understand Montgisard, you have to understand the pressure cooker Baldwin was living in. In the 12th century, leprosy wasn't just a medical condition, it was a spiritual exile. To be a king with leprosy was a walking contradiction. You were supposed to be the most Christian king, yet you carried the mark of the damned. While Saladin was unifying the Muslim world, creating a powerhouse that stretched from the Nile to the Tigris, Baldwin was watching his own court fall apart. His nobles weren't looking at him as a leader, they were looking at him as a countdown timer. They were already measuring the throne for his successor while he was still sitting in it, waiting for the disease to finish the job. The invasion of 1177 wasn't just a military strike, it was Saladin's attempt to kick over a rotting house. He expected the door to fall off its hinges. He expected a kingdom in mourning, led by a boy who was too sick to care about his crown. He could not have been more wrong. Saladin brought 26,000 men to end the Crusader states once and for all. He brought the pride of Egypt. He brought the ferocity of the desert tribes. He brought a plan that was, by all accounts, perfect. But he forgot one thing. He forgot that a man who is already in hell doesn't fear the fire. Imagine the psychological state of those 500 knights. They were not looking at a vibrant hero. They were looking at a boy whose face was already beginning to deform, whose eyes were clouding, and whose hands were clawed by the infection. Yet, when he spoke, the world listened. When he rode, they followed. There is a specific kind of courage that only exists in the presence of a leader who has nothing left to gain. In this story, we aren't going to give you the sanitized, textbook version of these events. We are going into the mud. We are going to talk about the smell of the camp, a mix of copper, horse sweat, and incense. We will explore the weight of the male and the psychological warfare of a king who refused to hide his deformity behind a silken mask until he absolutely had to. We are going to explore how a boy who couldn't cry turned his tears into a rain of steel. The clock was ticking for Baldwin, but on the fields of Montgisard, he made time stand still. He stood there, 500 against 26,000, and he didn't pray for survival. Survival was off the table. He prayed for the strength to show the world that a king is defined by his spirit, not his skin. The heat of the sun was blinding, the dust was choking, and the enemy was overwhelming. But as the first ranks of Saladin's army began to charge, Baldwin IV did something no one expected. He didn't hide in the center of his knights. He didn't stay in the back. He rode to the front, bandaged and broken, and prepared to do the impossible. The stage was set for a miracle, but this was a miracle bought with grit and sacrifice. It was the moment a boy became a legend, and an empire learned the cost of arrogance. But why did Saladin, the master of the desert, fail to see him coming? Why did he allow his army to scatter? The answer lies in the very disease that was killing the king. Saladin viewed Baldwin's leprosy as a weakness that had already won the war for him. He believed the boy was incapacitated. He believed the leper boy would never leave the safety of Jerusalem's high walls. This overconfidence was the crack in the armor that Baldwin would eventually shatter. We are going back to the beginning. Back to the day the curse first appeared in the palace gardens of Jerusalem. Because to understand the hero of Montgisard, you first have to understand the tragedy of the boy who couldn't cry. You have to understand the isolation of a child who was told by his doctors that his body was a cage. History is full of giants, but every now and then, a shadow rises to dwarf them all. This is the shadow of the leper king. This is the moment the world forgot, and the battle that changed everything. Are you ready to see what happens when a dying boy decides to live forever? Then let us begin the journey into the heart of the crusade. Let us look past the mask and into the eyes of the boy who held back the tide. We are about to witness the collision of two titans, one whose kingdom was rising and one whose life was falling apart. This is the chronicle of the unbroken. This is Montgisard. To understand the steel in the soul of the king who faced Saladin, we have to look back to a quiet afternoon in the royal gardens of Jerusalem. The year was 1170. The sun was golden, the air was filled with the scent of cedar and jasmine, and a group of high-born children were playing. Among them was Baldwin, a 9-year-old prince with golden hair and a future that seemed as bright as the city's white stone walls. They were roughhousing, as boys do, chasing each other and engaging in the kind of competitive pinching and scratching that defines childhood. But there was a witness to this game. William of Tyre, the prince's tutor and a man of immense intellect, was watching from the shadows of the colonnade. He noticed something that chilled him to the marrow. While the other boys shrieked in pain or laughed when they were pinched, Baldwin remained silent. His face was a mask of indifference. William watched as the other children, sensing something strange, began to pinch the prince's right arm with increasing force. They dug their nails into his skin. They twisted. They drew blood. Baldwin didn't flinch. He didn't cry. He didn't even look at his arm. He simply continued to play as if his flesh were made of wood. William called the boy over, his heart pounding with a dread he couldn't yet name. He took the prince's arm and, with a heavy heart, began to experiment. He used a needle. He pierced the skin. He watched for the reflexive jerk of a child in pain, the narrowing of the eyes, the gasp of air. None of it came. Baldwin looked at his tutor with a curious, innocent expression, unaware that his world had just ended. William would later write that it was at this moment he realized the boy was being consumed by a silent, invisible monster. At first, the court physicians tried to dismiss it as a temporary numbness, a fluke of the nerves. They applied ointments. They prayed. But the pale spot on his arm grew. The numbness spread. The diagnosis was eventually whispered in the dark corners of the palace: leprosy. In the 12th century, this was more than a disease. It was a social and spiritual apocalypse. We have to look at the clinical reality of what Baldwin was facing, because the leper king is often romanticized in fiction. In the medieval mind, leprosy was known as Lazarus's curse. It was believed to be the physical manifestation of sin, a rotting of the soul that had finally reached the surface. To be a leper was to be legally dead. In many parts of Europe, if you were diagnosed, you were forced to stand in an open grave while a priest threw dirt over your head, symbolizing your transition from the world of the living to the world of the dead. You were given a bell to warn people of your approach and a heavy cloak to hide your deformity. You were a ghost with a heartbeat. But Baldwin was a prince of Jerusalem. He couldn't be cast into a leper colony. He was the heir to the most contested throne on earth. This created a tension that would define every second of his life. On one hand, he was the most Christian king, the defender of the Holy Sepulchre. On the other, he was a man whose very presence was considered a biological and spiritual threat. The medical horror of 12th century leprosy was agonizingly slow. It doesn't kill you quickly. It dismantles you. It starts with the nerves, the destruction of the peripheral nervous system. This is why Baldwin felt no pain. But that lack of pain is a trap. Because you cannot feel, you do not notice when you burn your hand on a candle or when a stirrup chafes your leg to the bone. Infection sets in. The skin begins to thicken and ulcerate. The cartilage in the nose and ears begins to collapse. The vocal cords thicken, turning the voice into a dry, haunting rasp. Imagine being a teenager, knowing that your face is slowly melting, that your hands are curling into useless claws, and that every person who bows to you is secretly recoiling in horror. Most people would have retreated into the shadows. Most would have surrendered to the despair. But Baldwin had a kingdom to hold, and he had a rival rising in the south who didn't care about his suffering. Have you ever felt like you were falling apart while everyone around you expected you to be perfect? Have you ever had to hide a deep, personal agony just to keep your world from collapsing? Baldwin didn't have the luxury of a private life. His decay was a matter of national security. Every time he stepped onto a balcony, he was performing a miracle of willpower, pretending that he wasn't a walking tomb. While Baldwin was fighting this internal war, a titan was rising across the border. We need to talk about Saladin. It is a mistake to view Saladin as a simple villain. He was, in many ways, the mirror image of the ideal Crusader king. He was brilliant, deeply religious, and possessed a sense of honor that often put the European knights to shame. But Saladin had a vision that left no room for the Crusader states. He saw the presence of the Franks in Jerusalem as a temporary infection, a foreign body that needed to be purged to unite the Islamic world. Saladin had done what no one thought possible. He had united the fractured factions of Egypt and Syria. He was no longer just a general. He was the head of a unified war machine. He sat in Cairo, watching the news from Jerusalem with a predatory patience. He knew the king was a boy. He knew the boy was sick. To Saladin, Baldwin was not a threat. He was a tragedy waiting to be concluded. He viewed the impending conquest of Jerusalem not as a brutal slaughter, but as an inevitable restoration of order. And Saladin wasn't the only one waiting for Baldwin to fail. Inside the walls of Jerusalem, a different kind of monster was circling. We call them the vultures of the court. While the king was undergoing agonizing treatments, scorching his skin with hot irons in a desperate attempt to wake up the nerves, the nobles of the Kingdom of Jerusalem were busy carving up his corpse. Men like Guy de Lusignan and Reynald of Chatillon weren't interested in the king's health. They were interested in his succession. They saw a teenage boy who would never have an heir, and they saw an opportunity for absolute power. The internal conflict was suffocating. Baldwin was surrounded by advisors who were constantly whispering in his ear, trying to manipulate his decisions to favor their own bloodlines. They treated him like a placeholder. They ignored his commands, they embezzled from the treasury, and they waited for the day his lungs would finally give out. Imagine the psychological toll. You are 16. You are losing your sight. You are losing your strength. You are facing the greatest military mind of your generation. And when you look around your own dinner table, you see men who are literally praying for you to die faster. This is where the legend of Baldwin IV truly begins. Not in the battle, but in the decision to lead despite the rot. He refused to be a placeholder. He leaned into his duty with a ferocity that stunned his enemies and terrified his friends. He used his disease as a shield. Since he was already dead to the world, he didn't care about the political consequences of his actions. He was the only person in Jerusalem who wasn't afraid of the future, because he knew he didn't have one. The central problem wasn't just the 26,000 soldiers marching from Egypt. It was the fact that the kingdom was rotting from the head down. Baldwin was a man caught between a body that was failing and a court that had already abandoned him. He was the only thing holding the gears of the kingdom together, and those gears were covered in blood and betrayal. As the year 1177 progressed, the vultures grew louder. Saladin's spies reported that the king's condition was worsening. They said he could no longer lead an army. They said he was blind in one eye and that his hands were useless. Saladin smelled blood in the water. He gathered his forces. He crossed the Sinai Desert with a confidence that bordered on arrogance. He didn't just plan to win, he planned to walk into Jerusalem and take the keys to the city without a fight. But he forgot that a cornered animal is the most dangerous thing in the woods. And a cornered king who has made peace with his own death? That is a force of nature. Baldwin knew the nobles were plotting. He knew Saladin was coming. He knew his time was running out. So, he made a choice. He wouldn't die in a bed, surrounded by priests and vultures. If he was going to go, he would go in the sun, in the dust, and in the thick of the fray. He would show his people and his enemies that a crown is held by the spirit, not the flesh. The stage was set. The boy who couldn't feel was about to make the entire world feel the weight of his resolve. The vultures were circling, the Titan was approaching, and the leper king was about to draw his sword for the very first time. This is the moment where history turns. If you are finding this deep dive into Baldwin's struggle as intense as I am, do me a favor, hit that like button. It helps the algorithm push these stories of resilience to more people who need to hear them. And tell me in the comments, do you think Baldwin's lack of pain made him a better general, or was it his biggest weakness? I want to see your theories. The peace of the Levant did not break with a sharp crack. It dissolved in a slow, suffocating wave of shimmering heat and the rhythmic pounding of 26,000 sets of hooves. By late 1177, the geopolitical chessboard had shifted in a way the world was not prepared for. Saladin was no longer a mere rising star or a local chieftain. He was a planetary force. He had spent years consolidating power with the patience of a master weaver, tying together the disparate, often warring threads of Egypt and Syria into a tapestry of absolute, unified authority. To him, the Crusader states, the small slivers of Frankish control along the coast, were nothing more than a historical accident. They were a lingering fever that the body of the Middle East was finally ready to break. Saladin's grand gambit began in the heart of Cairo. This was a masterpiece of 12th-century logistics. He didn't just march an army, he moved an entire civilization's worth of military might. Imagine the sight from the southern watchtowers, a line of dust that never ended, stretching back into the Sinai until it vanished into the curvature of the earth. He brought with him the elite Mamluks, warriors who had been bought as children, converted, and trained with a singular focus to be the ultimate extensions of their master's will. These men were the heavy metal of the Ayyubid machine. Alongside them were lightning-fast horsemen from the deep desert, archers who could hit a moving target while at a full gallop, and endless ranks of seasoned infantry. This was not a raid for gold or cattle. This was an erasure of a border. The sheer scale of the Ayyubid war machine was designed to intimidate as much as to destroy. Saladin carried with him a mobile city of supply trains, siege engines packed in crates, and thousands of camels carrying the water necessary to cross the furnace of the Sinai. He wasn't just planning to fight a battle, he was planning to occupy a country. His confidence was his greatest asset, but in the quiet moments of the march, it was also the first stone laid in the path of his undoing. Saladin looked at the intelligence reports coming out of Jerusalem and saw a kingdom in hospice care. He saw Baldwin, a boy whose health was a national secret and a public tragedy. Saladin was a man of logic, tradition, and physical prowess. He believed that a king who could not lead from the front, who could not grip a sword or sit a horse without assistance, was a king who had already abdicated his right to rule. He assumed that when his shadow finally fell over the land, The leper boy would do the only logical thing: retreat behind the massive stone walls of Jerusalem, pray to a silent God, and wait for the end to come. But Baldwin IV had different plans. He knew a truth that his generals were too afraid to admit. If he allowed Saladin to reach the gates of the Holy City, the war was already lost. Jerusalem could survive a siege, but it could not survive the isolation of a kingdom burned to the ground. If the fields were salted and the villages destroyed, the city would become a tomb. So, Baldwin did the unthinkable. He ordered the call to arms. The reaction in the royal court was one of pure, unadulterated panic. The vultures we spoke of, the nobles who were already mentally measuring Baldwin's coffin, were terrified. They urged him to stay. They told him that leaving the city was suicide. They pointed to the numbers until their voices went hoarse. 26,000 against a few hundred. It wasn't a military maneuver, it was a mass funeral. But Baldwin didn't listen. He couldn't afford to. Have you ever been told that your situation was terminal? Not just in a medical sense, but in your career, a relationship, or a struggle where the experts say it's over. Everyone around you is already speaking about you in the past tense. They are making plans for a world where you no longer exist. Baldwin's kingdom was in hospice, but he refused to sign the papers. He chose to act as if his body were whole, even as it was failing him in real time. He looked at the 26,000 and decided that his 500 were enough, provided they had a leader who didn't know how to quit. Baldwin's defiance was a quiet, cold fury. He didn't shout. His voice, rasped by the thickening of his vocal cords, didn't need to be loud to be heard. He ordered his knights to prepare for a suicide march to Ascalon. Ascalon was the strategic fortress on the coast, the gateway between Egypt and the heart of the kingdom. If he could hold Ascalon, he could theoretically cut Saladin's supply lines. It was a brilliant move on paper, but a desperate one in reality. The march to Ascalon was a trial of fire. Baldwin had to be secured to his saddle with leather straps because his legs no longer had the strength to grip the horse's flanks during a gallop. His hands, which had lost the ability to feel the reins, were bandaged and braced so he could steer his mount through visual cues alone. Every jolt of the horse's gait was a reminder of his own fragility, yet he rode at the very front. He arrived at Ascalon with a pitifully small force, roughly 500 knights and a few thousand infantry. It was a drop of water in an ocean of enemies. When Saladin arrived and saw the king pinned inside the walls of Ascalon, he reacted with what can only be described as professional disdain. He didn't even bother to engage in a full-scale siege. He viewed Baldwin as a bird in a cage. He left a small detachment to guard the gates and then made the fatal mistake that would change history. Saladin looked at the map and saw a clear path to Jerusalem. Because the king was incapacitated, Saladin believed he could afford to be sloppy. He allowed his massive army to scatter. He permitted his soldiers to pillage the countryside, to burn the crops, and to break into smaller groups to cover more ground. He treated the invasion of a sovereign kingdom like a leisurely stroll through an undefended garden. He was so sure of his victory that he stopped acting like a general and started acting like a conqueror who had already won. Inside the walls of Ascalon, the atmosphere was thick with the smell of horse sweat and desperation. The vultures were silent now, trapped in a stone box with a king they had spent months undermining. But Baldwin wasn't looking at them. He was watching the horizon. His spies, men who risked everything to navigate the enemy-clogged roads, brought word that the Ayyubid army was spread thin, overconfident, and distracted by the riches of the coastal plains. Let's pause for a second. If you're inspired by the sheer audacity of a man who refused to stay in his cage, hit that like button right now. It helps the algorithm push these stories of resilience to more people who need to hear them. And tell me in the comments, do you believe willpower alone can outweigh physical strength in a moment of crisis? Type will if you think the mind is the ultimate weapon. The trap was set, but it wasn't Saladin's trap, it was Baldwin's. The king saw the gap. He saw that Saladin's main force had moved toward Jerusalem, leaving only a thin screen of troops. Baldwin ordered the gates of Ascalon to be opened. The breakout was a high-stakes gamble. If they were caught in the open, they would be slaughtered. If they failed to catch Saladin before he reached Jerusalem, the city would fall. They rode with a singular, terrifying purpose. These 500 knights weren't just soldiers, they were the fearlessness of the damned. When you have already lost your future, You don't fear the edge of a sword. You become the edge. As the king's force slipped out of Ascalon and began their frantic race across the desert, the reality of the situation set in. There was no more room for politics. There was only the heat, the dust, and the distant thunder of an empire that thought it had already won. Saladin was moving toward a small hill called Montgisard, relaxed and confident. He didn't know that behind him, the walking corpse had risen. He didn't know that the 500 knights he had dismissed as a nuisance were currently transforming into a kinetic missile aimed directly at his heart. The march was grueling, a test of spirit over flesh. The Knights Templar, the most disciplined and lethal branch of the Crusader military, rode alongside the king. They saw the blood seeping through his bandages. They saw the way he struggled to keep his head upright under the weight of his helmet. And in that struggle, they found a motivation that no healthy king could ever provide. They weren't just fighting for a city, they were fighting for the boy who refused to let them down. Saladin's army was stretched out in a long, vulnerable line, burdened by loot and slowed by their own numbers. They were near the hill of Montgisard when the first scouts saw a glint of steel on the horizon. It shouldn't have been there. It was impossible. But there it was. A small, tight wedge of heavy cavalry, emerging from the dust like a vengeful spirit. At the head of the formation, a white horse. And on that horse, a king who had already made his peace with the grave. The gathering storm had reached its peak. The impossible battle was no longer a theoretical disaster, it was a present reality. The air in the desert grew still, the silence of the dunes pregnant with the coming violence. Saladin turned his horse, his eyes narrowing as he realized the leper boy hadn't just escaped, he had hunted him down. The chess pieces were off the board. Now, there was only the charge. The breakout from Ascalon was not a grand procession of trumpets and banners, it was a desperate, silent heist executed in the shadow of twilight. While Saladin's detachment focused their attention on the massive main gates, expecting a traditional sally, Baldwin and his 500 knights slipped through the narrow side posterns. They moved like ghosts. Their horses' hooves had been muffled with rags, and their armor was covered in surcoats to prevent the moon from glinting off the steel. They didn't ride toward the safety of the inland hills. They rode toward the very center of the Ayyubid storm. The race across the burning desert was a masterpiece of human endurance and sheer, stubborn defiance. Baldwin, 16 years old and physically dismantling, was the pace-setter. To look at him in the shimmering heat haze was to see a specter in iron. He was strapped into his high-backed war saddle like a piece of cargo, leather thongs winding around his waist and thighs to compensate for the muscles that leprosy had turned to water. His hands, fingers curled into rigid, immovable claws, were bandaged to the reins with strips of linen. He couldn't feel the horse beneath him, but he could feel the mission vibrating in his chest. Behind him, the 500 knights watched their king. They saw the blood seeping through the white linen on his arms, turned dark by the desert dust. They saw him swaying in the heat, nearly losing consciousness, yet never once ordering a halt. This was the birth of the fearlessness of the damned. When the man at the front is already half dead and refuses to stop, the men behind him lose the ability to feel afraid. They were no longer fighting for a king, they were following a miracle. As they rode, the scouts brought back reports that would have broken a lesser commander. Saladin's army wasn't just large, it was a sprawling ecosystem of war. But it was also vulnerable. Because Saladin believed Baldwin was a non-factor, he had allowed his men to indulge in the luxury of the victor before the victory was even won. They were spread over miles of terrain, their ranks broken by hills and wadis, their focus divided by the weight of stolen gold and captives. Baldwin saw this not as a challenge, but as a target. He knew that a massive army is a clumsy beast. If you strike the heart fast enough, the limbs will never have time to react. They intercepted Saladin's force near a small, unremarkable limestone hill called Montgisard. It was a place that history should have ignored, but it was about to become a graveyard for an empire's pride. The Ayyubid army was not in battle formation. They were a sprawling, disorganized mass of 26,000 men, encumbered by the massive amount of loot they had stripped from the coastal villages. Their weapons were sheathed, their horses were unburdened, and their minds were already on the spoils of Jerusalem. They were a city on the move, loud and arrogant, and they were utterly blind to the reaper approaching from their exposed flank. Before the order was given to charge, the air grew unnaturally still. The desert wind died down, and the only sound was the heavy breathing of 500 horses and the distant, confused murmur of Saladin's camp. Baldwin called for the Bishop of Bethlehem. Out of the dust and the ranks of the knights rose the true cross. It was the most sacred relic in Christendom, encased in gold, silver, and jewels, carried on a sturdy frame. In the blinding midday sun, the relic didn't just reflect light, it seemed to radiate a physical, pulsing heat that cut through the fear of the soldiers. The psychological impact on the 500 knights was instantaneous and electric. These were men of the 12th century, living in a world where heaven and hell were as real as the sand beneath their feet. To them, the presence of the cross meant they were no longer just soldiers, they were the literal instruments of a divine will. Baldwin, despite the agony that every movement cost him, insisted on dismounting. It took 3 men to help him down. He collapsed to his knees in the burning sand before the relic, his voice a dry, rattling rasp that barely sounded human. He didn't pray for his own health. He prayed for the strength to save his people. When he was helped back into his saddle, his eyes were different. He wasn't just a leper king anymore. He was a symbol of total, unyielding defiance. The central problem of Montgisard was the physics of the impossible. How do 500 men break a line of 26,000 without being swallowed whole? Most people think of medieval battles as a chaotic, unorganized brawl. They aren't. They are about the precision delivery of kinetic energy. Baldwin was about to turn his 500 knights into the most lethal, concentrated projectile in the history of the Levant. To understand the charge at Montgisard, you have to understand the terrifying mechanics of the Frankish heavy cavalry. This wasn't a disorganized gallop, it was a calibrated acceleration of weight and iron. Imagine a wall of steel, men and horses weighing over 1,500 pounds each, locked knee to knee. They began at a walk to keep the line perfectly straight, a slow, deliberate advance that allowed the horses to build a rhythmic momentum. Then a trot. Then a canter. By the time they reached the charging distance, they were a solid, unbreakable mass of muscle and metal moving at nearly 20 miles per hour. The kinetic missile was designed to hit a single point with such overwhelming force that the laws of biology simply ceased to apply. When a knight's lance, couched firmly under his arm and braced against his entire body weight, hits a target at that speed, the energy doesn't just pierce, it explodes. It shatters shields, pulps internal organs, and snaps human bone like dry kindling. Saladin's army looked up from their pillaging to see a wall of white and red charging out of the direct glare of the sun. There was no time to form ranks. No time to set pikes. No time to brace for the impact. The suddenness of the attack was its own weapon. In the Ayyubid camp, the cry of "The leper! The leper is here!" spread like a wildfire, carrying with it a supernatural dread that paralyzed the veteran infantry. The clash was a sonic event that drowned out the world. The sound of 500 lances splintering simultaneously against flesh and wood was like a lightning strike in a dense forest. The knights hit the center of Saladin's line with the force of a falling mountain. The first 3 ranks of the Ayyubid infantry didn't just fall, they were erased from existence. Horses trampled over the fallen, their hooves acting as hammers, while the knights used the sheer weight of their mounts to push deeper into the mass of men. The chaos that followed was visceral and absolute. The knights didn't stop once their lances broke. They dropped the splintered wood and drew their broadswords, hacking through the confusion with a desperate, rhythmic ferocity. You could hear the crunch of bone, over the screams of dying horses and the panicked shouts of men who had been told the king was too sick to fight. The elite Mamluk Guard, Saladin's personal protectors, tried to close the gap. These were the most feared warriors in the East, men who had been undefeated for years. But they were facing men led by a boy who had already survived hell. The Templars, fighting with a cold, mechanical intensity, carved through the yellow silks of the Mamluks like a scythe through wheat. The environment itself seemed to conspire against the Ayyubid force. The limestone dust of Montgisard, kicked up by the thunderous charge, created a blinding white shroud. In this fog of war, the 500 knights appeared to be an army of thousands. Every time a Saracen soldier turned to face a foe, he was met with the terrifying sight of a Frankish knight emerging from the dust, unyielding and seemingly immortal. And there, at the very tip of the spear, was Baldwin. He wasn't leading from a hill 3 miles away with a map and a glass of wine. He was in the red. He was in the teeth of the Mamluk Guard. Because his hands were bandaged to the reins, he couldn't use a shield for protection. He rode with a sword in his one functional hand, his white surcoat rapidly turning crimson with the blood of his enemies. Every time he swung his blade, he risked falling from his horse, an event that would have been an immediate death sentence. Yet, he drove deeper into the enemy center. He wasn't looking for a standard or a captain. He was looking for one man. He was looking for Saladin. Baldwin's presence on the field was a psychological tactical nuke. To the Saracens, a man in his condition should have been bedridden, gasping for air. Seeing him ride, seeing him kill, shattered their understanding of reality. They weren't just fighting a king, they were fighting a man who had conquered death itself before the battle even started. Saladin, for the first time in his illustrious career, was staring at the impossible. He saw his elite guard, the men who were the foundation of his empire, being trampled by a handful of walking corpses. He saw his 26,000 men, once a proud army, turning into a panicked, screaming mob. The sheer audacity of the attack had shattered the Ayyubid morale. They believed they were fighting ghosts. They believed the leper king was a demon sent from the depths of the earth to punish their arrogance. The Mamluks died where they stood, refusing to retreat, forming a wall of their own bodies to give their master the precious seconds he needed to escape. This was the most desperate moment of Saladin's life. He saw his golden tent overrun. He saw his personal treasury captured. He was forced to flee on a racing camel, a humiliating sight for a man of his stature, leaving behind everything but his life. He rode through the night into the desert, the sound of the leper boys' charge echoing in his ears like a curse. The slaughter continued for hours as the Crusader force, fueled by a decade of repressed fear and the adrenaline of the miraculous, chased the broken remnants of Saladin's army. The heavy cavalry was relentless. They didn't just want a victory, they wanted a message. They wanted every soldier in the east to know that as long as the leper king drew breath, Jerusalem was an unbreakable fortress. By the time the sun began to set over the limestone ridge of Montgisard, the desert was littered with the remnants of an empire. 500 had broken 26,000. It was a victory so lopsided, so statistically improbable, that it defied every military convention of the age. It was a moment where the spirit of a single man had rewritten the laws of war. The fields were choked with the abandoned loot, silk, spices, and weapons, but the knights didn't care for the gold. They cared for the boy on the white horse. What happens to a man's mind when he realizes his 50-1 advantage meant absolutely nothing? Saladin would spend the next decade of his life obsessing over this defeat. He would analyze every mistake, every tactical error, every logistical failure. But the answer wasn't in his tactics. It was in the eyes of the boy who refused to be a victim. Have you ever faced a Saladin in your own life, an obstacle that looked too big to move, a challenge that should have crushed you by the numbers? And did you find the Baldwin inside you to charge anyway? Baldwin remained on the field long after the last of the enemy had vanished into the twilight dust. When he was finally helped down from his horse, his bandages were soaked through with blood, sweat, and the grime of the battlefield. He was nearly blinded by the glare of the desert sun. His body was screaming in a language of pain only a leper can truly understand, and he could barely stand on his own feet. But as he looked at the true cross, still standing tall amidst the carnage, he knew he had bought his people time. He had bought Jerusalem another decade of life. The cost of this miracle was steep. As the sun dipped below the horizon, the true extent of the king's sacrifice became apparent. The physical toll of the charge, the hours spent strapped into a saddle in the sweltering heat, and the sheer mental effort required to command had taken years off his life. He had traded his remaining days for the safety of his people. He hadn't just won a battle. He had achieved the most impossible military victory of the Middle Ages. He had proven to his friends, his enemies, and himself that a dying body is no cage for a living soul. The leper king had become the Lion of Jerusalem. The miracle at Montgisard was over, but the cost was only beginning to be calculated. The knights who survived looked at their king with a new kind of reverence, a feeling that bordered on worship. They didn't see a sick boy anymore. They saw a legend that had walked through the fire and come out made of iron. But as the adrenaline faded and the cold, unforgiving desert night set in, the reality of Baldwin's condition returned with a vengeance. The exertion had accelerated his biological decay. The victory had saved Jerusalem, but it had effectively signed the death warrant of its savior. The king had given his life for his crown, one heartbeat at a time. Saladin's retreat was a nightmare. Without supplies, harassed by local tribes, and haunted by the memory of the White Horse, his grand army withered to almost nothing before reaching Egypt. He returned to Cairo not as a conqueror, but as a survivor of a catastrophe. It would take him 10 years to recover his strength, 10 years of looking over his shoulder for the boy who couldn't feel pain. As the Crusader army began the long march back to Jerusalem, the citizens came out to meet them. They expected news of a glorious death. Instead, they were met with a living miracle. The bells of the city rang until they cracked. But in the center of the parade, the king sat slumped in his saddle, his head bowed, his strength gone. He had won the war, but he was losing his life. The miracle at Montgisard ended with a sunset that bled across the horizon, painting the limestone hills in shades of bruised purple and deep crimson. But for the Ayyubid Empire, the nightmare was only beginning. While Baldwin's knights knelt in the blood-soaked sand to offer thanks before the true cross, Saladin was experiencing the most harrowing flight of his life. This was not a tactical withdrawal, it was a desperate, panicked scramble for survival. The man who had entered the kingdom with the swagger of a conqueror was now a fugitive, riding a racing camel into the teeth of a rising desert storm. The Great Retreat was a 100-mile gauntlet of sheer misery. The weather itself seemed to turn against the retreating Saracens as if the earth was rejecting their presence. A fierce Khamsin, a hot, dust-laden wind, erupted across the Sinai, swallowing the sun and turning the world into a blinding, abrasive void. Saladin's army, already shattered by the shock of the Frankish charge, disintegrated in the grit. Without supplies, their waterskins dry, and their horses collapsing from exhaustion, the survivors were picked off by local Bedouin tribes who smelled the scent of a falling giant. Saladin himself nearly perished multiple times, his racing camel the only thing standing between him and the vengeful desert. But the greatest loss Saladin felt was not the gold, the prestige, or the territory. It was the loss of his elite guard. The yellow-clad Mamluks, the finest warriors of the East and the bedrock of his personal authority, had been almost entirely wiped out at the hill of Montgisard. They had formed the final wall around their sultan, buying his life with their own bodies. As Saladin crossed the Sinai, looking back at the wall of dust that hid his shame, he wasn't just thinking about the territory he'd lost. He was thinking about the boy on the white horse. He realized that the leper was not a victim to be pitied, but a sovereign who had mastered the ultimate secret of war, that the spirit can command the flesh to do the impossible. While Saladin fled to Cairo to lick his wounds and rebuild his shattered pride, the kingdom of Jerusalem was erupting in a celebration the likes of which it had never seen in its short, bloody history. The bells of the Holy Sepulchre rang until the towers vibrated. The streets were carpeted in flowers, palm fronds, and the expensive silks captured from Saladin's camp. Baldwin IV was carried back to the city not just as a king, but as a living saint. The people surged toward his litter, trying to touch the hem of his surcoat or the metal of his greaves. They saw in him the very hand of God. To the common people, Baldwin was proof that the Crusader states were divinely protected. But behind the silk curtains of the royal litter, the tragic victory was revealing its true, horrific cost. The exertion of the charge, the hours of being strapped into a saddle in the sweltering heat, the violent vibrations of the combat, and the sheer mental force required to hold his failing nervous system together, had acted as a catalyst for his disease. The Lion of Jerusalem had spent his life's blood to buy his people 10 years of peace. The disease, which had been a slow-moving invader, now became a predatory beast. The decay accelerated with terrifying speed. In the months following Montgisard, the nerves in Baldwin's face began to fail. The leonine features associated with advanced leprosy, thickened, folded skin and a flattened nose, began to settle into his face, turning the handsome prince into a figure of horror. Most devastatingly, the light began to dim. The disease moved into his eyes, causing a gradual, agonizing loss of sight. By the time he was 18, the king who had outmaneuvered Saladin was nearly blind, seeing the world only as a blur of shapes and shadows. The weeks following the return to Jerusalem were a blur of agonizing treatments and rapidly progressing symptoms. The prince who had once been golden was now unrecognizable. The leonine facies, the characteristic thickening of the skin on the forehead, cheeks, and chin, set in with a cruel finality. His eyebrows fell away, and his nose began to flatten as the cartilage was consumed. But the most terrifying development was the encroaching blindness. Leprosy often attacks the eyes through the destruction of the nerves that control the blink reflex, leading to corneal drying and eventual opacity. Baldwin began to live in a world of perpetual twilight, his kingdom becoming a place of voices and smells rather than sights. His voice, too, became a casualty of the crusade. The infection invaded his larynx, thickening his vocal cords until his once clear command became a dry, haunting rasp. It was a voice that sounded like wind moving over old parchment, yet it carried more weight than the shouts of 1,000 healthy men. When he spoke in the council chambers, the room fell into a silence so profound you could hear the heartbeat of the guards at the door. He used this physical limitation as a tool of statecraft, forcing his arrogant nobles to lean in, to focus, and to acknowledge the physical reality of the sacrifice he was making on their behalf. He entered what historians call the years of shadow. This is perhaps the most poignant and inspiring chapter of his life. A king's primary duty in the 12th century was to lead his men in battle, to be seen as the physical incarnation of the state's strength and vitality. Baldwin could no longer walk without help. He could no longer see the borders of the kingdom he was defending. He was eventually forced to lead from a litter, a stretcher carried by 4 strong men. Yet, he refused to hide. He attended every council meeting, his face now hidden by a silk veil or a silver mask to spare his subjects the sight of his ruin. Imagine the scene at the council table, a group of armored, healthy, ambitious men like Raynald of Chatillon and Guy de Lusignan, arguing over the future of the realm, their voices dripping with greed and ego. At the head of the table sits a figure draped in heavy, incense-scented robes, his face hidden, his voice a ghost-like rasp. Yet, despite his physical collapse, Baldwin remained the most powerful presence in the room. He didn't need eyes to see the treachery in his court. He could hear it in the tone of their voices and the hesitation in their answers. He didn't need a sword to strike fear into his enemies. His reputation as the king who would not die was enough to keep the borders secure. His mind remained sharp, a cold and brilliant diamond trapped in a body of clay. This leads us to one of the most painful and recurring questions in the study of leadership. Ask, why is it that the greatest, most selfless leaders are almost always followed by the smallest, most ego-driven men? While Baldwin was sacrificing his last drops of energy to protect the realm, the men in his wake were already sharpening their knives to carve it up. How do we build a legacy that can outlast the person who built it? Or is greatness something that can never truly be inherited? As Baldwin's health plummeted, the vultures stopped circling and began to land. Chief among them was Guy de Lusignan. Guy was everything Baldwin was not: handsome, physically robust, a champion of the tournament circuit, and utterly devoid of the wisdom or the humility required to rule a kingdom under siege. He had married Baldwin's sister, Sibylla, positioning himself as the heir to a throne he was fundamentally incapable of holding. Baldwin despised Guy, sensing his lack of character, yet he was trapped by the laws of succession and the need for a healthy male to eventually lead the army. While the court bickered, Saladin was not idle. He spent the decade after Montgisard obsessed with his defeat. He completely reorganized his military, focusing on discipline and unity. He built a system of lightning-fast communication across his empire and, most importantly, he learned never to underestimate the Franks again. He was a titan rebuilt, waiting for the one man who had beaten him to finally fall. The contrast between Baldwin's reign and what followed is the tragedy of Jerusalem in a nutshell. Baldwin led through the power of his spirit and the sacrifice of his body. He knew that peace with Saladin was a delicate, strategic necessity that required patience and ironclad resolve. Guy and his allies, however, believed that they could win through brute force and loud proclamations. They mistook Baldwin's tactical restraint for weakness. We need to talk about the psychological warfare of the royal litter. When Baldwin could no longer ride a horse, he refused to be confined to a bedroom. He ordered a specialized litter to be constructed, a platform of wood and silk that could be carried into the thickest of the political fray. When he entered the council chambers, a heavy incense was burned, partially to signify his status, but also to mask the smell of the ointments and the rotting flesh. He sat behind a veil, a silhouette of royalty, forcing these ambitious men to listen to his raspy, measured commands. He was a master of the long pause, using the silence of the room to let the vultures sweat under the weight of their own treachery. Have you ever worked in an environment where you knew your colleagues were waiting for you to fail? Where every mistake you made was tallied, and every moment of vulnerability was a weapon they could use against you? This was Baldwin's daily life for 15 years. He wasn't just fighting Saladin, he was fighting a war of attrition against the people who were supposed to be his brothers in arms. He kept them in check not through physical strength, but through a terrifying clarity of purpose. He was the only person in the room who didn't fear death, which meant he was the only person in the room who couldn't be bought. The political sabotage by men like Reynaud of Chatillon was particularly galling. Reynaud was a loose cannon, a man who viewed the fragile peace with Saladin as an inconvenience. He conducted raids on merchant caravans, effectively spitting in the face of the treaties Baldwin had nearly died to secure. Every time Reynaud broke the peace, it was Baldwin who had to pay the price, politically, strategically, and physically. Baldwin was forced to mobilize his failing body to keep the peace, often traveling hundreds of miles in his litter to intercept Saladin's retaliatory strikes. This brings us to the inevitable shadow of the year 1187, the Battle of Hattin. To understand why Baldwin's victory at Montgisard was so miraculous, you have to look at what happened just 2 years after his death. At Hattin, the unity that Baldwin had forged through his own suffering was completely discarded. The new leadership, driven by ego and a lack of tactical patience, marched the entire army of Jerusalem, over 20,000 men, into a waterless trap under a blistering sun. Hattin was the anti-Montgisard, where Baldwin had used concentration of force and the element of surprise. The successors of the leper king used vanity and hesitation. Where Baldwin had stayed with his men in the thick of the fight, the leaders at Hattin were paralyzed by their own internal rivalries and eventually surrendered their men to slaughter. The result was the total destruction of the Crusader army, the capture of the True Cross, and the fall of Jerusalem to a revitalized Saladin. The tragedy of Guy de Lusignan cannot be overstated. When Baldwin finally realized he could no longer hold the regency, he was forced to hand power to Guy. It was a decision made in desperation. Guy immediately proved his incompetence. During the campaign of 1183, Saladin invaded again, and Guy, commanding the largest army the kingdom had ever raised, refused to engage. He allowed Saladin to burn and pillage at will, paralyzed by his own indecision and the infighting among his subordinates. Baldwin, hearing of this from his sickbed, was so incensed that he stripped Guy of his power, demanding to be carried to the front himself. There is a legendary account of the blind, dying king being carried in his litter at the head of the army, his presence alone forcing Saladin to withdraw. But the end was inevitable. By 1185, Baldwin was a skeleton held together by willpower and silk. His death at age 24 left a void that was immediately filled by the very chaos he had spent his life preventing. The vultures finally had their meal. Sibylla, his sister, crowned Guy as king, and the stage was set for the horns of Hattin. In his final months, Baldwin attempted one last desperate act of statesmanship, the coronation of his nephew, Baldwin V. He knew his own breath was short, and he hoped that by crowning the child, he could bypass the ego of Guy de Lusignan. The scene was heartbreaking. The dying king, unable to stand, blind, and gasping for air, presided over the ceremony from his litter. He was a man trying to plant a tree whose shade he knew he would never sit in. He was trying to bequeath a future to a kingdom that was already burning. In 1185, the fire finally went out. Baldwin IV, the leper king of Jerusalem, passed away. He died in a city that was safe only because he had willed it to be. He had spent 15 years in a body that was a prison, yet he had achieved more than most kings do in 50 years of perfect health. He was buried in the Church of the Holy Sepulchre, the very heart of the world he had sacrificed everything to protect. The aftermath of his death was exactly what he had feared. The vultures took control. The spirit of sacrifice was replaced by a spirit of greed. The kingdom that had been saved by 500 knights at Montgisard was lost by 20,000 men at Hattin. But the legacy of the leper king doesn't end with the fall of a city. It lives on in the very idea of the unbroken spirit. Baldwin IV remains a metaphor for every person who has ever been told that their condition, their disability, or their math makes victory impossible. He proves that the only terminal condition is a lack of will. Saladin would go on to be remembered as one of the greatest leaders in history, and rightfully so. But in his own journals and in the silent halls of his palace in Cairo, the ghost of Montgisard always lingered. He knew that his greatest victory was won only because the greatest man he ever fought was no longer there to stop him. He knew that at Montgisard, he hadn't just lost a battle, he had witnessed a miracle of the human spirit. The end did not come with the thunder of hooves, the splintering of lances, or the roar of a battlefield. It came in the suffocating stillness of a candlelit chamber in Jerusalem during the spring of 1185. Baldwin IV, the leper king, was only 24 years old when he finally let go of the reins he had held so tightly against every law of biology and every rule of political logic. His body, which had been a grueling, ulcerated battleground for 15 years, was finally at peace. The walking corpse had finished its march. But as the heavy bells of the holy city began their mournful, rhythmic toll, something remarkable happened, something that revealed the true measure of the man who had just passed. In the vast military camps of the Ayyubid Empire, there was no cheering. There was no celebratory feast for the death of a rival who had thwarted their greatest ambitions. When the news reached Saladin that his most formidable antagonist had finally succumbed to his illness, the Sultan did not exult. Instead, he ordered a period of profound, respectful silence. Saladin, a man who valued chivalry and ironclad resolve above all else, recognized that the world was now a smaller, lesser place. He famously remarked that the world would not soon see another leader who could hold a crumbling kingdom together with nothing but the strength of a rotting hand. Even his enemies paused to mourn a worthy foe, proving that respect is the only currency that transcends the borders of war, faith, and blood. They recognized that they hadn't just been fighting a king, they had been fighting a phenomenon. Baldwin was buried in the Church of the Holy Sepulchre, laid to rest among the Crusader kings who had come before him, men who were taller, stronger, and more physically imposing. Yet, none of them had carried a heavier burden, and none had earned a more enduring place in the memory of the desert. As the stone was slid into place, the vultures immediately descended, and the unity he had bled to maintain began to dissolve almost instantly. But for one brief, shining decade, a boy whom the world had written off as cursed had been the only thing standing between an empire and its goal. Today, we look back at Baldwin IV not just as a historical curiosity or a tragic figure in a silver mask. He has become the ultimate metaphor for the human spirit's refusal to surrender to the math of life. His life is a total rejection of the idea that we are defined by our limitations, our scars, or our traumas. He was a boy who couldn't feel his own hands, yet he made an entire continent feel his presence. He was a king who was legally dead by age 9, yet he lived more in his 24 years than most men do in a century of perfect health. This is the saddle up anyway philosophy. Think about the sheer, crushing weight of Baldwin's daily reality. Every single morning, he woke up knowing he would be a little more blind, a little more frail, and a little more isolated than the day before. He knew that his throne was surrounded by traitors and his borders were surrounded by a titan. He knew that, statistically and logically, he had already lost the war before it even started. But every morning, he called for his servants to wrap his limbs in fresh linen. He called for his armorers to buckle the heavy steel over his decaying skin. And he called for his grooms to lead his horse to the mounting block. He didn't wait for a miracle cure that wasn't coming. He didn't wait for the odds to improve or for the sun to be less hot. He didn't wait for the vultures to stop circling. He understood a truth that most of us spend our whole lives trying to learn. You don't need a perfect body to lead a perfect life. You only need the courage to show up and face the desert. To Baldwin, the impossible wasn't a wall, it was a horizon he chose to ride toward. The legacy of the unbroken is a reminder that the most dangerous fortress in the world isn't made of stone, it's made of excuses. It's the fortress we build around ourselves when we decide the odds are too high to try, or that we are too damaged to be of use. Baldwin could have stayed behind the high walls of Jerusalem. He could have played the victim and asked for pity. He could have allowed the disease to be his entire identity. Instead, he made his disease a mere footnote in the story of his defiance. He proved that fate is not a cage unless you agree to sit behind the bars. We often think of heroes as people who are born with advantages, the strongest, the fastest, the most gifted. But Baldwin shows us that true heroism is found in the gaps. It is found in the man who has every reason to quit and chooses to double down instead. He turned his lack of sensation into an immunity to fear. He turned his impending death into a license to be bold. When you are already standing in the grave, the threats of empires lose their power over you. We all have our own version of the 26,000. We all have those moments where the dust cloud on the horizon is so massive that it blots out the sun and makes our efforts seem like a joke. Maybe it's a health crisis that feels insurmountable, a financial collapse that seems final, or a dream that feels 50 times larger than your current capacity to achieve it. The world looks at you and says, just stay in the fortress. It's safer there. No one expects you to win this anyway. Just fade away quietly. But I want to ask you the same question Baldwin's presence asked his 500 knights at the base of the hill of Montgisard. What is your 26,000, the overwhelming odds in your life right now? And will you charge, or will you stay in the fortress? Success isn't always about the final victory on a map. Jerusalem eventually fell. The kingdom Baldwin saved was eventually lost. But the victory of Montgisard remains eternal because it was a victory of the will. It remains as a beacon for anyone standing in the dark, wondering if their effort matters. It matters because Baldwin chose to be the tip of the spear. He chose to give his people 10 years of life they wouldn't have had otherwise. He chose to be a legend instead of a statistic. He chose to live in a way that forced even his conquerors to bow their heads in his absence. If this story has shifted something in the way you view your own struggles, if you feel the ghost of the leper king telling you to mount your horse and face your fears, I want you to take action. Do not leave this conversation as the person who started it. First, hit that subscribe button and join the Impossible History series. We are building a community of people who believe that the spirit is stronger than the math. We don't just study history, we study the resilience that made it. Second, I want you to go to the comments right now and name your 26,000. Tell us the overwhelming odds you are facing today. Don't hide them in the dark where they can grow. Put them in the light where they can be conquered, and then type these 4 words, I am charging. Let the story of the leper king be the spark that sets your own desert on fire. Because as Baldwin IV proved 8 centuries ago, a person who has made peace with their own limitations is a person who can change the world. You don't need to be whole to be a hero. You just need to refuse to blink when the empire arrives at your door. The king is gone. The empire is gone. But the sand remembers the boy who wouldn't move. What is your 26,000? And will you charge?